So my name's Edward Walker. I go by Ned. I'm an adjunct in the political science department, and I'm the executive director of the program in Eurasian and East European Studies, which is part of the Slavic Institute. So it's a privilege for me to be invited to, cross borders here at the Institute of East Asian Studies. And obviously the topic is of particular relevance to us. So it's a pleasure for me to welcome today Marissa Smith, who will be talking about basically Russian or Mongolian relations with the Soviet Union and in particular and Russia since the collapse. And Marissa currently has a teaching position at the Anza College down in the peninsula. She got her PhD last year in anthropology at Princeton University. So, welcome to the West Coast, the best coast. She has a number of publications to her credit. I won't go into them, but they generally deal with Russian and Mongolian national identity, relations. My impression is that her particular focus in anthropology is sort of the anthropology of international relations, which is a useful perspective for most political scientists who don't get exposed to that all that much. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Marissa and look forward to her slideshow in particular.
First of all, before I begin, I just wanted to say thank you to Ned for being the introducer and discussant, and thank you to Frank for organizing the series, and of course everyone else at the Institute for East Asian Studies here and the Mongolia Initiative. I'm really excited to be a part of this series. And also thank you to the production team for making such really nice videos. I'm really thankful that I'm having this opportunity. Since the beginning of recorded Mongolian political history, brotherhood has been a central form of social relation among Eurasian peoples. The Secret History of the Mongols, an account of the descent of Chinggis Khan and the foundation of the Mongol Empire, describes numerous relations between elder and younger brothers and how these are begun, sustained, broken, and renegotiated. Today, many of the Secret History's most often told and referenced episodes are about brotherly relations. For example, Alangoa and Holun's lessons to their children who are fighting, that includes Temujin or Chinggis Khan himself and his brothers, as well as their ancestors. Chinggis's famous alliance and subsequent conflict with Jamukha, and also the incorporations of different Mongolic and Turkic peoples into the empire, many of whom are today claimed as predecessors of the various Mongolian nationalities or undested. It's also interesting to note that the first portion of the Secret History about Chinggis's earliest ancestors, he is descended from the youngest sons who are sort of abandoned by the older brothers, and then they have some sort of reconciliation. In this paper, I'm going to describe how relations of siblingship and its others continue to define Mongolian politics, particularly in the realm of international relations. Contemporary Mongolian foreign policy is founded on the third neighbor policy, or Gorvendakhoshboduk, which emphasizes relations with countries beyond Mongolia's two superpower neighbors, Russia and China. This third neighbor policy is, in essence, about maintaining friendly or brotherly relations with as many nations as possible, and that does include Russia and China. Which is important to point out, as this policy, I think, has been misinterpreted by various of the third neighbors, in the sense that each of these third neighbors sometimes thinks that they can be the third neighbor, in exclusion to not only the other third neighbors, but Russia and China. So in the case of the various kinds of siblingship in the Secret History, the relationships of brotherhood and neighborhood, the idea is to have many of these and get them to not conflict, and also to be satisfactory for as many of the different participants in these relationships as possible. The Secret History, which President Enkbayer decreed should have a place in every Mongolian home and the government building, is not just a text that may be read as containing many exemplary and ambiguous scenarios related to complicated relationships between siblings. The creation and circulation of the text itself demonstrates the importance and difficulty of maintaining multiple and multiplying sibling relations, many blurring boundaries between households, territories, and nationalities. Historians argue that the text was composed and initially presented as part of successful efforts to pass power from Chinggis to his third son, Ogedei, whom Chinggis had apparently designated as his preferred successor. Some have even proposed that Ogedei Khan himself penned the text, while others believe that an adopted son of Chinggis's mother was in charge of the translation. So again, some sort of older brother or potential older brother of Ogedei was involved. So in this scenario, as in the secret history itself, several principles of hierarchical relations and exchange that came into conflict had to be navigated and upheld so as not to cost relationships. In conventions of inheritance and sibling relations still current in the Mongolian cultural region, the third son does not have a designated position. Tolui was the youngest son, or Otkan, who would, according to usual kinship conventions, stay with his father until the father passed, and thus this youngest son would inherit all the property that had not already been designated to older siblings as they married and established their own households. On the other hand, it's the quality of eldest that often maps onto that of leader. In this case, it was Jochi and Chagatai who were the elder brothers to Ogedei and Tolui. Chagatai pressed the case that Jochi was not Chinggis's legitimate son, and thus moved to claim the position of eldest and leader for himself. However, in the case of Ogedei, and later cases of succession, the inheritance of political power as Khan did not just follow either or both of these conventions. They were weighed, balanced, and contested along with still other kinds of relations. In the Ikurtai, or great assemblies that were called upon the death of the Khan, including one that Jochi's son, Batu Khan, suddenly abandoned the siege of Vienna for in order to attend and possibly succeed his uncle Ogedei. At that point in Mongolian history, the empire had already split into several separate political bodies or hordes with distinct associated territories. And by the way, this word horde is apparently related to the contemporary Mongolian word orden, which is a word that's still used to refer to that very government building where this copy of the secret history rests. So, returning to Jochi, the sons of Jochi, Orda, and Batu, Orda had settled near the Volga. Before return east to the Ikurtai, chose Guyuk, the son of Ogedei, to become the great Khan. Batu established the Golden Horde after sieging numerous Rus city-states, and finally Kiev itself. So, turning to contemporary political relations as well as Mongolian-Russian relations. Though the Golden Horde is remembered by most Russians today first as a yoke, Y-O-K-E, or Mongol-Tatarskoye Igo, relationships of brotherhood between Russians and Mongolians are, I would argue, more influential and international as well as intimate personal relations than this framing of conquered and conqueror. An understanding of Russian-Mongolian relations in the frame of siblingship is also important to studying other bilateral relationships, because what Mongolians expect of their many third neighbors should be read in the context of the relations that they are involved with their so-called eternal neighbor, Wieczny Sąsiad, which means not China, as I think many in the Anglophone world might assume, but refers to Russia. During the 20th century, the relationship of socialist brotherhood came to complement sibling relationships in the sense of being between members and leaders of distinct political bodies, mirroring, probably more than somewhat unintentionally, those in the context of the Mongolian Empire. As a member of the Eastern Bloc, Mongolia was placed in a field of socialist brotherhood with countries from Cuba to Romania to Vietnam, but it was also in a further particular kind of relationship with Russia. The Mongolian People's Republic was the second communist country in the world, established in 1924 with the effort of Soviet Russian troops well before the Soviet Union itself came into existence. While Russians were positioned as eldest of brothers throughout the socialist bloc, for Mongolians this was particularly so, even in the frame of socialism, isolated from longer histories of Russian-Mongolian interactions. And this relationship also continues. The largest infrastructure systems and industrial enterprises were Soviet Mongolian, and for instance, the Trans-Mongolian Railway, the Ulaanbaatar-Tumursam or Ulaanbaatar Railway, is a joint Russian-Mongolian enterprise to this day. So this slide is a monument to the 65th anniversary of the establishment of that railway, with a very nice map where you can see it goes all the way from near Lake Baikal down, well, the Mongolian part obviously is at the border there, but it extends all the way down to the Chinese border through Mongolia. Additionally, since 2014, Mongolians and Russians have been able to pass between their two countries visa-free and stay for periods of up to 30 days. Mongolian politicians, military leaders, engineers, and a range of professionals have studied in Russia since the 1960s and before, and they continue to do so to this day. To turn now to an analysis of news media and some ethnographic vignettes, I will narrate some contemporary developments in Russian-Mongolian relations. I discussed that while since returning to Mongolia since their absence, and worse for brotherly relations, demands for the repayment of Soviet debt in the 1990s, Russian policymakers now position themselves not as, quote, elder brothers, but rather in a relation of neighbor to Mongolians. The success of this move, however, has been mixed. In addition to the visa-free regime in place since 2014, talks to increased trade have been long ongoing. And Mongolian politicians have maintained pressure on Russian counterparts to import Mongolian meat, modernize jointly owned and operated infrastructure in Mongolia, including but not limited to the railway, and also build new, as they call them, mega projects, as occurred during the Soviet period. And so this is, lately this has been particularly hydroelectric dams. And the former projects include major mining enterprises, as well as city infrastructure, thermal power stations, things like that. While the neighborly relationship is apparently one of equitable free trade and open borders, it has not yet been realized, and perhaps cannot be without also the Russians accepting a role of elder brother, which is what Mongolian policymakers, diplomats, and also many common citizens I have met press for. In other words, as many anthropologists have emphasized when writing about contemporary ideals of international free trade and equality, hierarchy is inescapable and always an integral part of all exchange. So a recent example demonstrates this dynamic playing out in the most recent events of Russian-Mongolian relations. On the 95th anniversary of relations between Mongolia and Russia, so figured from the actual independence of 1921, which was celebrated this fall, Delgerma, who is currently the ambassador of Mongolia to Russia, announced Mongolia's interest in joining the Eurasian Economic Union. An interview of the ambassador with major Russian news agency VSD reviews the current state of Mongolian-Russian relations, again naming this relationship of neighbors, while calling this relationship not yet achieved and placing it in the context of positive socialist era ones, which was, of course, when this relationship of elder and younger brothers was frequently named. And she calls for intensification of current directions along those lines, making, again, very specific requests of Russia and Russians. So interest in joining the Eurasian Economic Union, in contrast to, there's, for example, been a lot of English language political commentary on some similar moves from Moldova recently. I would argue that these do not constitute an uncomplicated turn towards Russia and away from, the West. But it's rather, I think, a set of bids and a negotiation of relations of neighborliness and friendliness between Russia and Mongolia. And again, I don't expect something similar. Ambassador Delgerma begins by calling Russia Mongolia's eternal neighbor, so again, Вечный сосед, and also that calling Russia a good neighbor, Добрый сосед. She then continues by expressing satisfaction with political and strategic relations, but says that there's, quote, very good potential in economics and trade. For people who don't read Russian, you maybe notice on this ticker here, it says that Medvedev has given an interview to the Central Television Station of China. So this is, of course, it's beyond the scope of this presentation to place things in the context of Russian-Chinese relations, but that's very, very much relevant. Finally, the interviewer asks about cultural relations, which Delgamar turns to points about there being not enough Russian tourists in comparison to European tourists, and she also states that not enough Mongolians are studying and working in Russia. And this is despite Russia and Mongolia having this visa-free 30-day travel regime since 2014. And there are also many entry points along the Russian-Chinese border that only Russians and Mongolians are allowed to use. I think is also worth mentioning. Finally, the interviewer inquires as to whether it is the Mongolian side or the Russian side which is not ready to move forward on these issues, to which the ambassador replies that there are currently groups discussing. So in this exchange, Delgamar presses the issue of neighborliness. If it is to mean open trade and movement, she points out that this does not characterize current Mongolian-Russian relations. By bringing up the free trade agreement with Japan, she not only chastises Russians by alluding to an old regional rival, but equates the ideal of free trade with that of neighborly equity. Comments about joining the Eurasian Economic Union, of course, are also part of a critique of the current state of Mongolian-Russian relations to be less than neighborly. To make Russian-Mongolian relations equal requires action, she maintains, on the part of Russians to remove tariffs and help in and return to the modernization of Mongolia. To achieve equality with Russians, then, Mongolians are making requests of Russians, requests that, at least from one perspective, are situating Russians as hierarchically superior to Mongolians. And the superiority, again, it's of a particular kind and a highly contested kind. What does it mean that again, what does this older brother, younger brother relationship mean? And though Delgamar never names that relationship, I think it's pretty clear that that's kind of that's in the background here. So moving from media discourses and policy to ethnographic encounters and intimacies. This failure of Russian-Mongolian relations to operate as neighborly, with Russians at fault, was also expressed by a colleague of mine, who I will call Janusz, who is a Polish researcher I met this summer in Ulaanbaatar during the International Congress of Mongolists, which is a big conference that takes place takes place every 5 years, and it's been going on since the 60s, and it's not just folks from the US and Mongolia and Russia, but many of the Eastern European countries have departments of Mongolian studies, and they have long been very active in that conference. So as Janusz and his colleagues, some of whom were Polish Siberians who had come from Ulan-Ude in Irkutsk, I asked them, as we were having drinks after a day of presentations, to comment on movements of Mongolians into Buryatia in the frame of this visa-free regime. So Buryatia, of course, that is the province directly north of Mongolia through which the railroad runs. I understood that Mongolians were traveling into Russia to buy consumer goods, both to resell in Mongolia and for their own consumption. So this sort of suitcase trade, as it was called in the early 90s. Earlier in the spring, a friend of mine who's from a solidly middle-class professional urban apartment-dwelling background told me that many groceries had become so expensive in Ulaanbaatar that it was more cost-effective to travel across the Russian border once a month and buy a 4-week supply of non-perishables like dishwashing liquid. And when I visited the largest open-air market in Ulaanbaatar this summer, there were just cars lined up against the curb near, this was Narantul, so one of the major open-air markets, and their trunks were opened to display all kinds of Russian dry goods. I did not, however, need to relay these two anecdotes to Janusz and his colleagues from Buryatian cities, however, and as they attested to the number of Mongolians coming to Buryatian cities to trade in such goods, and the anxiety that it had provoked among Buryatian Russians, who they told me were printing calls in Mongolian in Russian language newspapers to act cultured, to wit kulturny or soyoltoy. And Janusz, they actually were very critical of people reacting in that way. And Janusz joked, saying, "Okay, this is the kind of neighbors that Russians are. They're the only ones who want to come over and visit the neighbors. So they don't want Mongolians coming into Russia, but they want to go to Mongolia." So Janusz's comments point out that the reality of movements between Russia and Mongolia by Russian and Mongolian citizens and that of their exchange, while, like Delgerma's, is making a criticism of how the relations of neighbors is not being realized. Also, like Delgerma, when Janusz criticized Russian-Mongolian relations in private conversation, he did not use this language of brotherhood or explicitly call for Russia to be a leader or elder brother. But he did, I think, point to how this neighborly relation is not sufficient to characterize what's going on. In encounters with Mongolians on trains and stopovers in the countryside, however, in which I myself am sometimes taken for some sort of Russian, the relation of brotherhood is oftentimes explicitly named, and it's phrased as being in a state of difficulty and renegotiation. So this also chimes with how, using the language of brotherhood, Delgerma did speak approvingly of Soviet-era enterprises, calling on Russia not just to modernize the railway and other Russian assets in Mongolia, but to follow through on agreements to build new ones, these mega projects, the nuts and bolts of the proposed One Belt, One Road projects, which is what they're called from the Chinese perspective. Mentions of relations with Japan and China also imply that Mongolia may have not just third neighbors in those countries, but potential other elder brothers. So during my first period of fieldwork in Mongolia in 2007, I was greeted by a middle-aged visitor to a herding family with whom I was staying with the words, "Are you my elder brother or younger sibling?" This was in Galut Sum of Beinhonger Aimag, which is an area strongly associated throughout Mongolia with a particularly robust herding economy. But when I was staying there, traveling around the Sum, one often encounters canals that were built by Soviet engineers. I'm not sure if they were connected with the military or not, but anyway, there were these Soviet-built canals that have long since lain empty, and locals would always also complain about the fact that these canals weren't working, and talked about how it was very detrimental to the local economy that those weren't running anymore. So such comments are not mere nostalgia, as Gregory de Laplace, who is another anthropologist working in Mongolia, describes in his work on the abandoned uranium mining city of Mardai on the northeastern Mongolian border with Russia. So he says that he found that local Mongolians there do not just relate to the city and its ruins nostalgically, but they rather frame the city as a gift left by Russians who had left in the 1990s. When the city was stripped and much of this was sold as scrap. But he was surprised that nobody really complained about any of this. They didn't chastise the scrappers for dismantling the city and actually selling a lot of that scrap to Chinese traders. But they also didn't talk about dismantling this city as being an act of revenge or retribution or some sort of violence directed towards Russians who deserved it. And he also talks about how when former residents of this city, Russian citizens, came and visited the city, they would say that it's like Chechnya. So they actually felt, they did feel like there was some sort of violence that had happened to this place. De Laplace said that when these people were returned and visited the city, the local Mongolians were embarrassed about it. Again, suggesting that they did not intend that to be a violent act, the dismantling of the city. So while de Laplace is discussing the importance of objects in negotiating memory, however, I'm focusing on the ongoing nature of Russian-Mongolian relations. So while de Laplace finds the local Mongolian belief that Russians would return to Mardai and rebuild the city and its uranium mining industry ironic, in this discussion it should not seem ironic. In a 2015 article about his visit to Mardai, de Laplace continues that the ruins of Mardai are a kind of treasure, he calls it open-air treasure, or erden valuable, of the kind which another anthropologist, Morten Pedersen, he's defined these kind of valuables as being valuable because they are something outside of human relations. Another example would be maybe like meteoric iron. This is something that's fallen from space, and it's valuable because it came from, the non-human, essentially. However, something that I elaborated on in my dissertation is that Erden valuables also include herd animals, human children, precious metals that are mined and transformed into infrastructure by international industrial relations or enterprises. So these are valuables that come from beyond human social relations, but through human social relations, which are often fraught, but not, and rarely can they be just simply given up. The ruins at Mardai, like the Ulaanbaatar Railway and operating enterprise at Erdenet, retain their Russianness and position in Mongolian-Russian relations of neighborliness and brotherhood, no matter how conflicted and confusing these may have become. And Erdenet, by the way, so to turn to Erdenet, Erdenet was sold, it was announced the Russian half of, or 49% of the enterprise was sold this June. But again, this sense that it is still Russian has not dissipated. So when I first went to Erdenet, which was the site of my dissertation fieldwork in 2011, I was on the train. So Erdenet, again, it was established as a Soviet mining enterprise, Mongolian mining enterprise in the 1970s, and until today it has constituted up to, as much as a third of the Mongolian economy, of course, depending on what sort of indicators one wants to use, in terms of GDP, import-export volumes, government tax returns. The enterprise is also the major sponsor of the Mongolian Olympic team. So it's still quite a significant institution in Mongolia. To get back to the ethnographic anecdote, so I was traveling there to sort of set up where I wanted to do my anthropological research and just sort of stay for 2 years. I was on the train on this Ulaanbaatar Railway, which is also a Russian-Mongolian joint enterprise. Every night, trains move between Ulaanbaatar and Erdenet, like those that link Moscow and St. Petersburg. So embarking from either city in the evening, one arrives in the morning in the other city, ready to work and commute back to the first city the next night. On this particular trip, however, spring rains flooded the tracks, and it took over 48 hours to reach Erdenet. While this was frustrating for other passengers, for me, the delay was quite an anthropological opportunity. Towards the end of the trip, when one of the passengers had discussed my research project with me at length and then relayed it down the length of the train car, conversations about general relations between Russians and Mongolians were had with me, who had then become to those folks an American and not a Russian. So it had been sort of confusing because I had been speaking with people in Mongolian and in Russian and in English. Finally, when people kind of had established that I'm an American, they started telling me things about Russian-Mongolian relations in a different frame. So after we had passed the railway construction repair team and were enjoying the twilight, assured that we would reach Erdenet by midnight, someone told me that many Mongolians believed that Russians had not just dug up a lot of Mongolian gold, but that they had buried it in the ground, underneath Mongolians in bunkers or warehouses, which they called sklad, which is, of course, a Russian word. And then the Russians had left. This notion puzzled me for a long time, but it indicates better and more clearly than many other encounters and conversations I have had that Mongolians experience a continued, complex kind of relation with Russians, in which they experience forms of abandonment and yearning for return, as well as remembered abuse and need for recompense. So, to conclude, in the last 6 months, Mongolia's post-boom economy has bust. So referring to this mining boom that they were having in sort of 2010, 2011, 2012. I arrived this summer in Ulaanbaatar on June 28th, the day before the parliamentary elections. I just told a correspondent with Agence France Presse before flying from the United States that I expected the Mongolian People's Party to take the majority of parliament seats, and that since the latest election in 2012, anger about the mining boom that had never arrived had shifted its object from foreigners to government officials tied to the Panama Papers and other scandals. The Mongolian People's Party won in a landslide after the Democratic Party attempted a last-minute surge by announcing the sale of the Russian 49% stake in the Internet Mining Corporation. As evident in social media and expressed to me in conversations throughout the rest of the summer, this move backfired. Social media took off to brand the move as sale to an offshore entity, not a Mongolian bank, as it had been framed. So when this sale was announced just before the election, the Prime Minister, I believe it was the Prime Minister Saakashvili, who came on and said, now Erdenet is going to be 100% Mongolian. To which people got on Twitter right away and said, no, you've offshored it. With this really nice image, which I think one does not need to read Mongolian to get the drift of. And this also, as I've been mentioning, Panama Papers was a big scandal in Mongolia since February, and the Erdenet sale quickly became attached to that. In Erdenet, much like in the Russian media, people opined that it was Chinese who had acquired the 49% Russian stake of the mining corporation. When I was working in the Shishke Depression, which is an area northwest of Erdenet that borders Tuva, Mongolian researchers from Ulaanbaatar discussed the sales with me, who they framed as an expert on Erdenet, and put the residents of Erdenet themselves, who are mostly Mongolian citizens but from many minority nationality groups, in the frame of suspicion. So one of the Mongolian archaeologists I was working with asked me, are the people in Erdenet good people or bad people? Which was quite shocking. I'd experienced people being like, okay, they're different, and people in Erdenet are more Russian, and they're mixed, and this sort of stuff. But kind of asking me bluntly, are they good people or bad people, was taking it to a new level. In contrast, the position of Russia and Russians themselves were not much discussed and not characterized as good or bad, even as reports that the sale had been agreed to at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Tashkent in the spring entered the discourse around the sale of Erdenet. This silence and hesitancy to blame Russians is yet another example of the ongoing character of Russian-Mongolian relations and their ambiguity. An American-trained Mongolian civil engineer friend and I realized in the days after the election and announcement of the sale that the Ulaanbaatar Railway, via which all Erdenet copper and molybdenum concentrates must be shipped out of Erdenet and out of Mongolia, remains a Russian-Mongolian joint enterprise, and thus the mining enterprise, at least as a mining enterprise and not a piece of financial collateral, they're still under considerable Russian control. However, even if such were not the case, the character of Russian-Mongolian relations as eternal, as Ambassador Delgrama framed them, makes the sale of Erdenet, in the sense of complete abandonment of Russian-Mongolian relations by Russians, unbelievable and unachievable. This does not, however, make their character any clearer. As Mongolians move to resolve the current deep economic crisis after bonds issued to construct infrastructure can now not be paid back, due to the failure of a mining boom to materialize in the context of a global slump in commodities markets, the work of making neighborly or equitable relations on the one hand and brotherly or hierarchical relations commensurable will continue. As they have in the past, these will also continue to influence Mongolian relations with other neighbors and sibling nations. Thank you.
I've been asked to make some brief comments, which I'm happy to do. Marissa was kind enough to send me her remarks in advance, so I had a chance to read them first. So let me begin by saying I very much enjoyed the paper and the presentation. I learned a lot, first and foremost because I should emphasize I am not a specialist on Mongolia in general or on Mongolian relations with either the Soviet Union or Russia. I have done a good deal of work on Soviet and Russian nationality policy and, dealing with minorities and identity politics and so forth. So it's generally relevant to my work, but I know very little about Mongolia specifically. I will say that I found at the broadest level, it's very interesting to hear your take on how brotherhood or brotherliness, evoking the very well-known Soviet policy of bratstvo narodov, or the brotherhood of peoples, was understood and interpreted by Mongolians back in the Soviet period, and also how that continues to be the case today, that same understanding and interpretation of that particular concept still has an influence on Russian and Mongolian relations. I should point out that I'm sure that that's true not just for Mongolians, that if you looked carefully and you looked at the understanding of something like brotherhood or brotherliness and how it was understood by Tatars or Buryats for that matter, or Yakuts or anybody, that there's going to be some way in which they're going to receive that. It's going to be different than the way the predominantly Russian or Soviet broadcasters intended to be. But I did find that very interesting and convincing. So in terms of my comments and questions, I really only have two significant ones. So the first relates to language, and the key term, obviously, being brotherhood or bratstvo in Russian. I don't know what it is in Mongolian. And so as I understand it, the key passage here, at least as I understood it, in terms of the how it is, how that term is understood by many Mongolians, is the following. While my editorial comment, Russian promoted, end of editorial comment, neighborly relationship is apparently one of equitable free trade and open borders, it has not been realized, and perhaps not and cannot be, without also accepting a role between elder and younger brothers, as Mongolian policymakers, diplomats, and common citizens are pressing for. In other words, hierarchy is inescapable. So it's, from my perspective, slightly ironic, because as I understand what you're arguing is the Russians are saying, we should essentially have a kind of transactional relationship between equal parties, even though we're in fact much bigger, much richer, and more powerful. And the Mongolians are saying, in order, that's really not possible, that in fact our relationship is always going to be, to some extent, like one between an elder brother and a younger brother. And, clearly the elder brother is Russia. I find that, convincing in terms of language. But the question that I have is, I'm going to put it on my political science hat here, for which I apologize. But I'm going to say, how do we actually know that it matters? And when does it matter that it's rendered this way? So, to me, I can understand how it might matter more in kind of everyday life if you're trying to get at how your average Mongolian understands the relationship with Russia or regrets their departure, and so forth. But your long discussion of reasonably long discussion of the interview with the Mongolian ambassador implies that you think it has also, real bearing on the nature of the relationship between the two governments and the way officials speak and the way officials try to leverage Russians. And so my sense actually was that which is what precipitated the question really, is that the ambassador was actually, as I saw it, doing what ambassadors typically do, for the most part, which is first off, in diplomatic language, not trying to be provocative and trying to avoid provocative questions sometimes, but basically saying, we would like more foreign direct investment from Russia. We're in trouble now. We need help. You've more or less abandoned us in some respects at any rate, and we want more. We want you to come back the way you were in the Soviet period, and in addition to that, we want you to lower trade barriers, tariffs, on the one product that we can actually sell to you, because Russia is also a commodity producer, so it doesn't import much of what Mongolia exports. And so the one thing that they can really help out with this on the meat and meat products front. So the question is how is Mongolia really different in this respect? Wouldn't any small country in this situation with a very big neighbor that it has to deal with more or less behave the same way, and perhaps using slightly different language, but basically the policy and the outcome wouldn't be much different. And then the second question that I have kind of comes out of that, which is, China, which strikes me as the elephant in the room to some extent. You say in the paper that you gave to me to look at that you don't have time to deal with that, which is totally understandable in a short paper, and it's a huge topic. But China is much bigger on virtually all counts than Russia is. And in particular, Russia's economy is struggling now. China's is slowing, but China still has a ton of foreign direct investment potential that Russia really does not have. It has this huge One Belt, One Road initiative that promises to transform Eurasia in terms of infrastructure over a very long period of time. And so the question is do Mongolians talk about the Chinese the same way? Are they the same kind of elder brother? Even though they don't have the same kind of legacy projects that Russia does? And do they sort of assume that they have different obligations by virtue of the fact that, you used to be our elder brother and give us gifts that we've now allowed to no longer be useful and to degenerate, or how are they as a understood differently as an elder brother than Russia is? So I'll conclude with those questions. And if you want, we can just sit here.
Oh, okay.
Or if you want to step
how that
up.
would work for the.
Oh,
you should
you
probably
want?
stand up.
Okay, fine.
For the video
Sure.
purposes.
All right. And why don't you answer that, and then I'll field some questions for you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Those are really helpful. So I guess I want to sort of split that into two parts. So I wanted to elaborate a little bit more on how this brotherhood relationship is, more particularly in terms of Mongolian and how else this brotherly term is used, and et cetera. But I think I'll start with the other one first, which is, would any small country not act like this towards a bigger country? And for Mongolia, as you have gone in that direction, obviously the test case would be, how do they act towards China? And they very much do not act like this towards China. And someone who's an expert on this who's sitting in the room is Frank, so I will not I will not go outside my expertise, but I think a pretty good sort of in the news anecdote about this is the recent Dalai Lama visit. So the Dalai Lama just visited China, and there's been quite a bit of press. I haven't actually reviewed it as much as I probably should have before giving this talk, but essentially the gist of the headlines is, why is Mongolia potentially really alienating China by letting the Dalai Lama come at this time? They very much do not have this relationship with Chinese. There was a relationship with China in the 50s, before the Sino-Soviet split, when there were Chinese workers in Mongolia en masse building apartment buildings and industrial combines, and some of them actually remained in Mongolia, which is really fascinating. Sort of how those people who remained in Ulaanbaatar and Darhan and other places, Chinese, how they sort of were able to assimilate and not into Mongolian society, but it's quite different than the case with Russians. And one thing that Mongolians often express about Russians as part of the ambivalence is, well, without Russia, we would have been conquered by China, and we would have been absorbed by them. And something this archaeologist also told me this summer when we were having this conversation, are people in Erdenet good or bad, was, okay, we're friends with Russians, we're brothers with Russians partly because they look different than us, and we can tell they act different than us, they walk different than us. Like, we can tell the difference. We can't always tell who's Mongolian and who's Chinese, but we can tell who's Russian and who's Mongolian. So that is something they say also that I think is interesting.
That makes them inclined to be suspicious of Chinese?
Yes. Yeah, there's again, I would definitely want to yield the floor to Frank to talk more about these things, but there's there's definitely a sense that there's a kind of difference that can be maintained with Russians that can't be maintained with Chinese, which creates anxiety, is the term that Frank often has used in his work. So then I think this might transition to the other points I wanted to make about, what is this particular nature of brotherliness between Russians and Mongolians that might be different than, say, Russians and Yakuts or Romanians or Czechs or Bulgarians or something. So the term in Mongolian is like Akh Dunar, which is elder brothers and younger siblings. So you can't really express it without that hierarchical thing. And the context in which I actually found it used most in my field work was in talking about work collectives in the mining corporation, the mining enterprise. So it's sort of like we're all going to get together, our collective, and do things together in unity. So there's something that I need to work on more, talking about how that hierarchical distinction actually creates some sort of unified project that is equitable somehow. So I think that's an important piece that I didn't really get out enough. And this is something that actually I think comes out very strongly in The Secret History. It's this opening episode with Genghis Khan's ancestors, where the older brother has one of the younger siblings has been abandoned by his older brother's children. Eventually, they come back, and the younger brother, the younger uncle, says, like a coat needs a collar. So there's this saying proverb, and it means like, okay, I need a hierarchy of some kind. But then they unite and basically conquer these local people together. And that kind of something happens to that hierarchical distinction when they join, after the younger person says, okay, I will follow your lead. Yeah. So I don't know if that helps at all, but okay.
We have time for some questions, yeah, please.
In my tourist guidebook to Mongolia, there's a mention of a museum where the atrocities of one of the communist strongmen is displayed for Westerners like me to understand. Is there bitterness? The way if you talk to a Czech about the Soviet period, there's bitterness because of Soviet invasions. And is the bitterness just about political terms, or is it also culturally? Are Mongolians upset about the alcoholism or the cultural things that might have come with the Russians? I know there's alcohol came from the West in greater volumes than the local stuff way back in the middle of the ages. But I'm just saying, the Russians. Everywhere the Russians went, there was an alcohol.
So it's interesting because I've never really heard the alcoholism be attributed too much towards Russians, even though there are things like, there was a huge bottling of beverages is a pretty easy light industry to set up, and it was set up in Mongolia, and you could directly attribute this rash of easily available vodka to Soviet-Mongolian relations, but I've never really heard people do that. On the other hand, yes, as far as I think you're talking about the Museum of Political Oppression, I think it's called. So yeah, there definitely is. So and I definitely have heard people express this, but it actually has only been expressed to me while drinking with people. So it is something that does come out
to the Russians. as the authors of the culture, the communist culture, it
was directed, so the particular encounter I'm thinking of, it was directed to Russians are violent. Like they are just congenitally or something about them by their nature is violent. And this was someone who was Buryat, whose family had experienced the purges. So it was also deeply personal, right? So, and this was someone who worked at Erdenet who had participated in, being a high-level sort of, upper middle-class person who was a member of the intelligentsia and everything like that. So someone who had benefited in those ways still had this very deep experience of that in his family. So, yeah, there are definitely
tension between the brothers and neighbors. Thinking back on what I've read about Russian-Mongolian relations, but also Russian-Chinese relations, I get the sense that Russians have moved away from this kinship talk. Like there is more the emphasis on this kind of skill.
Yeah.
They used to have with China at the border.
Interesting.
We have neighbors.
Right.
But I get the sense that in Mongolia there's still this sense that the Russians are somehow kin. I think there's this. I don't know why there is this attachment, but I get the feeling that there's this sense that Russia is close, more than just a neighbor. It's really part of this history that Mongolia, developed into a modern nation through Russia, right?
Right. And there's something that Ned's comments also made me think of that makes me think of is there's also like a rejection of this like friendship. So like narumdal. People, when I've used that in other interactions with people, for example, these archaeologists I was working with this summer, they're like, oh, that's such like an old-fashioned like socialist term, and like, oh, Marissa just says that because she was like at Internet, and so friendship doesn't really do it either. So there's
because I think friendships can be broken, but brothers, you're in there forever.
Exactly.
You mentioned China being the elephant in the room in your talk. When I was doing my research, looking at the relation between the Mongols and Chinese, Russia was the big elephant in my room. you can't just take one, and I think it's kind of a
package deal.
Relation.
Two elephants.
Yes.
Two elephants.
That's crazy.
Very big countries.
And maybe this kinship, this desire for kinship, is also a way of relieving this anxiety about China, about the future, what could happen. It's like if we're in it together, if we're family, then somehow we're protected. I don't know.
Yeah.
There's no.
If it comes down to 2 against 1, like.
Yeah. China is a neighbor. China is the one you're pressed against, but you're not related to. There's no way you can imagine people in Mongolia talking about China as in terms of kinship.
No.
But you can with Russians with kinship, really?
Yeah.
Despite the racial differences?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Oh, Orna? Yeah.
I was just wondering how you can bring this model of brotherhood to the periods of the purges, right? And since you mentioned that the Eastern European countries, in terms of their relationship with Russia, they don't use the term, they don't see this the hierarchical brother, the older brother, and the younger brother model. Since Mongolia was the only country which was so much purged and so much demolished by the Soviets, to the extent that their entire education of the intellectuals happened through Russian models.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like this part of the control system, or the way the whole idea of this Soviet regime happened, the part of this is this hierarchical brotherhood.
Mm-hmm.
And if you could see that towards the purges and how this continuing through this model of brotherhood, making it accessible and making also the kids, right, is sort of moving to that direction of accession and different from others.
Yeah, I think that there would be a lot to be done in this direction, seeing how, how was this discourse actually employed and like from a top-down perspective.
The purges and the times of education.
Right.
Through the Soviet models, and then using this model of kids.
Right.
Being completely pissed.
And it's interesting because in like my encounters, so like this first encounter I had, you know, like the first time I was in Mongolia, when I spoke more Russian than Mongolian, but I had a little bit of Mongolian, you know, this person just came up to me in the countryside, and it was very ironic. Like, it was like, and the other interactions I had with people there in Russian was, oh, I know some Russian, siditye, like, sit down, that's what I was told in school. So it was, people were very consciously framing it in like, I know that this was something, you know, encouraged in a top-down way, but there's still something there that is real to people that they're still making an ironic comment on, right?
In other words, Russia is always the giver, right? And Mongolia has to be the receiver. And that's the kind of agency that's kind of, it's also a reflection of what the Russians saw, the type of, you studied the Golden Horde and those all this connection, right?
Mm-hmm.
Russia now seeing them, Mongols as blaming all the backwardness.
Right. This idea that we were made backwards because of the Mongolian horde. And,
and
yes.
that's why they have to be the givers of civilization.
Right.
They have to do it. So the whole system is a part of this re-education and control and
right.
Any other questions? Yeah, please.
Just a comment. I last week I was at Minneapolis. There was some person talking about the relation between, so it was within China, the Hui population and the Chinese state, and they also use this familial language. And the way you see the Han as, you know, China, the Chinese state as the mother. So, well, you know, you cannot really be angry at your mother. Sometimes your mother hits you, but it's for your own good. But they really embrace that language. I think it's really interesting, really, to look at how successful it was in the case of the Soviet Union. You still have this kind of attachment, this kin relations, and how successful it is in China. I guess there's the sense that you're not colonizing. You're sort of it's an embrace, right? We're all in it together. We're one family. And so, I don't know, it seems to be working pretty well.
Yeah, I'll definitely have to look that up. Sounds like a very interesting comparison.
A ton of that's still in post-Soviet space. I mean, there's tons of people who are very nostalgic for what they see as Soviet-era multiculturalism. And, you know, the notion of the, you know, elder brother was really a very muted and more or less brief rendering of the brotherhood of peoples. In the main, it was a brotherhood of equal people, and they never, you know, explicitly said, you know, the Russians are first among equals. It was, in many ways, implied, and particularly driven by the nature of language requirements. You know, what Russian was spoken, you know, in higher.
Well, and in Mongolia, like all higher education in Mongolia was in Russian, right? Yeah. Like if you went to university, everything was taught in Russian.
Right.
Like,
yeah, I mean, expertise is on a page, right?
Yeah.
Right, but
in internet we speak Russian when we're working, not Mongolian.
The way it was presented was as a, you know, brotherhood of equal peoples, and we're all in this together, and that's why there is a lot of this. I mean, it was in a large measure, you know, it wasn't, you know, it's a complex question, but it was definitely not completely false. I mean, you know, people felt and you know, at the time, and regret the fact that, you know, they didn't feel part of some big multicultural project, so that, you know, Kazakhs could feel reasonably comfortable in Moscow, and you know, so forth, or Russians in, you know, Almaty or whatever. Anyway, I'm.
Yeah. Oh, there's just a couple of other things about how this relationship has been framed, other than like brothers or older brother, younger brother. But of course, so this is also from this summer. It doesn't show up very well here, but it's you know, it's one of these Russia and Mongolia fought in World War II together kind of things, which I feel like that discourse is getting a little bit kind of going down a bit. But anyway, they had put this up for the last anniversary. And then, of course, there's this also doesn't come out very well, but this is the Friendship Monument in Erdenet, and it was painted up like this in 2012, and they've been keeping it up. It's really hard to photograph, but it shows, you know, two women exchanging Eirig or kumis or some sort of milk product and bread. And on the other side, on both sides, it doesn't really show it shows workers on both sides. It doesn't actually frame the Russians as being workers or industrialists and the Mongolians being any less industrial. So you see that's kind of the Mongolian side, and you see workers and the factory, and then you see much the same on the Russian side. They're kind of doing all the industrial stuff together equally. And I saw really interesting, in front of the Russian embassy this summer, there was also an exchange like this, but it was a Mongolian man presenting the milk to the Russian woman. So, which also goes into how marriage relations, there's been some very interesting work done by Carolyn Humphrey, of course, and other people that I think also could be elaborated on marriage relations too, and how there's of course also a long history of that in the secret history and other places. So, yeah, many ways of working it out other than brothers. Yeah.
Of course, they're brothers and then they're brothers.
Yeah, I mean, the important thing seems to be, I think, to me, that neighbors, friends, it's not strong enough or something. It's not ongoing enough. Your family is always your family. That seems to be the important bit.
Well, and it is, as I said, sort of counterintuitive that it's, the Russians who are kind of promoting this kind of transactional relationships between peoples, and they're saying, well, no, this is actually more like a kinship relationship, and you're the older, richer brother, so you should be doing more.
Yeah.
At any rate, we will conclude with
Right.
that and thank our speaker for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.